All right, let's dive right into this really intense White House briefing about the sudden ceasefire with Iran. You have this major military operation that just pivots to diplomacy. But as you'll see, the details are where everything gets incredibly complicated.
So right off the bat, you get this triumphant declaration from the White House press secretary. It's such a dramatic statement, and it frames the entire situation not just as a military success, but as a clear moral victory. This really sets the stage for the administration's entire version of events.
So in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly what the administration claimed happened. We're going to look at the military outcomes they touted, dig into the tough questions the press fired back, and then look at the very, very fragile path forward they laid out.
First up, let's talk about the military campaign itself, which they named Operation Epic Fury. The picture they painted for the press was one of an absolutely overwhelming and decisive victory.
Now, get this. The operation was originally planned to last 4 to 6 weeks, but the briefing really stressed that after just 38 days, the mission's goals weren't just met, they were achieved and exceeded. And that, they say, is what led directly to this sudden ceasefire announcement.
I mean, just look at this number. The sheer scale of the operation is pretty staggering. The White House reported over 13,000 targets were hit all across Iran in that 38-day window. It just paints a picture of a relentless and incredibly widespread air campaign.
And the claim results? They were described as absolutely devastating for Iran's military. The spokesperson flat out said the Iranian Navy was completely annihilated, claiming they destroyed more than 150 of their naval vessels. That includes, they said, 16 entire classes of warships.
You know, it wasn't just big, round numbers. They provided this level of striking detail to really showcase their success. They claimed that 97% of Iran's huge inventory of over 5,000 naval mines, a major threat to shipping, had been targeted and destroyed.
And to really hammer home the point about total air dominance, they pointed to this number, 0. Before the operation, Iran's Air Force was flying anywhere from 30 to 100 flights a day. After 38 days of this campaign, that number dropped to 0. Just nothing.
So here's the bottom line from the White House. This was a sweeping, strategic victory. They claim they didn't just wreck Iran's current military capabilities, but they also set back their future missile and drone programs by years. And maybe most critically, they claim to have completely stopped their path to a nuclear weapon.
Okay, so you have this picture of total military victory. The next big question is, how does that translate into a diplomatic opening? Let's get into the next phase. The official narrative here is actually pretty simple. They argue that the military pressure just became so intense, so overwhelming, that Iran simply had no other choice but to ask for a ceasefire. The spokesperson put it bluntly, Iran could no longer tolerate being bombed, and that created the maximum leverage they needed to get them to the negotiating table.
So the White House laid out this really clean cause and effect sequence of events. Step 1, intense military pressure. Step 2, Iran asks for a ceasefire. Step 3, the U.S. agrees, but only if the vital Strait of Hormuz is reopened. And that, Step 4, paves the way for new talks. It's all presented as a very linear path.
Right, so it sounds simple enough. But, of course, the devil is always in the details. And as soon as talks were mentioned, the actual terms of those talks became a huge point of contention, both in the room and in the media.
And this is where the White House drew a hard line in the sand. The spokesperson was absolutely adamant that while they were willing to negotiate, certain things were completely off the table. These were the president's red lines, especially the demand for a complete stop to all of Iran's nuclear enrichment, non-negotiable.
Now, this part's really interesting. To push back on what they called inaccurate media reports, the spokesperson drew this very sharp distinction. They basically said, look, there are two different Iranian plans here. The first one, a 10-point plan, was fundamentally unserious. We literally threw it in the garbage. But, they said, a newer, condensed plan? That was a workable basis to actually start a conversation.
Okay, so the administration lays out its case, and now you can just feel the tension in the briefing room ramp up as the press corps starts pushing back with some really tough questions about the president's rhetoric and, well, the reality on the ground.
And one of the most pointed questions of the day centered on the president's own words. A reporter brought up a threat he had made to destroy Iran's civilization if a deal couldn't be reached.
But the White House didn't back down one bit. The response was, essentially, that the president cares about one thing above all else: results. They framed that very strong threat not as a policy promise, but as a successful negotiating tactic that is precisely what forced Iran to agree to a ceasefire.
Then, reporters challenged what was maybe the most fundamental condition of the entire ceasefire. Citing reports from Iranian state media, they asked if the Strait of Hormuz, the critical waterway, was even open, because reports were coming out saying Iran had just closed it.
The administration's response was a flat denial. They called those reports false and insisted that there's a big difference between Iran's public posturing and its private assurances. In fact, they claimed that, contrary to the reports, commercial traffic in the strait was actually seeing an uptick.
So, you've got these conflicting reports, you've got a deal that already feels like it's on shaky ground, so where do we go from here? The briefing wrapped up by laying out the administration's official path forward. And what's really fascinating is that the spokesperson themselves used the term fragile truce. They admitted how delicate the situation is and gave a pretty wild reason. They said the U.S. operation was so successful at dismantling Iran's command and control that, ironically, it's now harder for Iran's leadership to even communicate ceasefire orders to their own forces.
So here's the concrete game plan we were given. A U.S. team, led by the vice president, is heading to Islamabad for 2 weeks of what they called extraordinarily sensitive negotiations. The first talks start Saturday. And just to underscore that fragility, U.S. military forces are going to remain at the ready.
And really, this is where it all leaves us. We're looking at a situation that's just full of contradictions. You have a truce that everyone admits is fragile, sitting right next to diplomatic red lines that are completely unyielding. It leaves us all with the same big question. Can a 2-week window of negotiation possibly bridge that enormous gap?